Hello everyone, I'm really sorry I wasn't able to make it today, but I've got one of these who's trying to make an early appearance and I don't think my wife would appreciate me not being there with her. So I was asked to talk to you about what it's like to be a transitioning kind of practitioner, someone who's going from being a student to a registered nurse. So to begin with, who am I and what have I done from a nursing perspective? I am a PG DIP student. I'm a registered children's nurse. I qualified just over 2 years ago, nearly 2.5 years ago, and I had a offer to do a 2-year rotation within my trust. So the idea was you worked in children's community for 6 months. You then worked in NICU, which we have a level 2 back then. For 6 months, I then did a little bit of work on the children's ward, which is a kind of everything and anything medical ward for 0 to 18. And then I also worked in A&E, managing 3 rooms down there for pediatrics. So it's been a really interesting kind of journey in consolidating my learning experience. So the first question is, how did I feel on day one when I arrived as a new registrant and then a month later? So I was pretty fortunate in that I started off in a children's community setting and I knew a lot of the team from when I was there as a student. So it wasn't as though I was coming in not knowing anything about where I was working. What I would say about that particular setting is that it was a very well-established team. They were all band 6s and I'm a newly qualified band 5. So you feel completely out of your depth from a knowledge perspective. These people have been working with a set amount of these set children for years. But the benefit about that is when you have a good established team, they should be there to kind of nurture you and help you grow. And that was very much the case. But I think when I have a look at all of the places, A&E was probably the most unique place to adjust to, because I'd never worked in that sort of setting when I was a student. I'd been qualified for about a year. My supernumerary status was supposed to be for a week working alongside a band 6 to figure out how things worked. In our A&E, you are the only pediatric nurse on shift, and my supernumerary status lasted for about 3 hours. And then you're just kind of left to get on with it, sort of thing. And I think initially it does feel quite daunting, but there's something about your training that does kick in. And as long as you can remember your ABCs, the basics, use your common sense, don't be afraid to say, no, I'm not happy to do that. You'll be okay. I think what you do learn within the space of a month in some settings, depending if you're working in a specialist area, is that you do kind of start to see the same things over and over again. So your experience and your expectations, and I think your scale of, this is bad and this is really bad, and this is how I'm going to treat and escalate through all of these things, it does change. And it's about your confidence. When you're a student, it probably takes you about a month just to figure out where things are, and that's very much the same when you're qualified. So the next question is, what do you wish you had known before you started in order to better prepare yourself? I think the thing with that is you can read and you can try and learn as much as you can possibly learn, but until you are there experiencing it firsthand, you're never going to feel prepared. And I think when you talk to some nurses who have been around for 2 or 3 years and they're kind of just moving out of that newly qualified period, or they've been there for 20 years and they're the most senior staff nurse around, one of the common things that they all say is they never feel prepared. They always feel as though they're learning something new and they're being challenged. I think kind of having that attitude of I don't feel completely prepared for this is actually quite healthy, because you don't fall into this trap of thinking, well, I know everything and I don't need to kind of push myself anymore. again, I think it's about knowing your basics rather than reading in depth weird things about, all sorts of diseases and conditions. Make sure that you are confident, as I say, like with your ABCs, using your common sense, try and home in your your gut feeling, and that will stand you in good stead. So overall, what has my last 6 months been like? Absolutely crazy. So as I say, I've been qualified for just over 2 years. I finished my rotation throughout all the areas of pediatrics within my trust, and I've learned a huge amount of information, kind of consolidating it. When I finished in A&E, I then moved to a special care baby unit, and I got a permanent contract there. And a lot of my learning has been kind of advanced because I've been sent on quite a few training courses, and I am just about finishing up with my QAS, so my qualification in speciality for neonates, and that's been 6 months at level 7, learning all about the sickest and most vulnerable babies, kind of working with babies who are 23, 24 weeks gestation on a level 3 unit, whilst commuting back and trying to bring all this information back to my local unit. But again, it's a great opportunity because you feel that after 2 years, you start getting a little bit comfortable with what you know and what you see. So it's about taking that opportunity when you can to kind of push yourself and put yourself into a bit of a scary zone. So it's a bit like being a student again, except I can access IVs and give drugs and cannulate and all sorts of things like that. What's my experience to date of preceptorship? It kind of depends on which preceptorship I'm talking about, and I'll be absolutely honest. I think preceptorships with your trust is going to change and vary depending what trusts you're working at. For mine, for my local trust, it was a 6-month preceptorship. It was interesting in the sense that it talked about the trust, how the NHS runs, how financing works, elements of psychology and working together and team building. But a lot of the preceptorship kind of course was based on adult nursing. And obviously we had different professions in there as well. But when you work in a very specialist area such as pediatrics, you kind of feel a little bit left out, that the majority of things don't really apply to you and what you're specifically learning. So yeah, it's useful as a preceptorship to kind of learn about how the NHS and how your trust works. I then went on a preceptorship for neonates, and that was very much tailored for another 6 months around neonatal care. And that was far more useful because, as I say, you could take the information that you learned and directly apply it to the area that you're working in. I think preceptorships are all about what you can take away from it, and kind of the important information that you can glean. So, even though the majority of you may be kind of completely bored, take what you can from it. So, what top tips would I give those heading towards qualification to help them manage their own transition? I would probably say the same thing I say to students when I have them, and that's there's never such a thing as a stupid question if you don't know the answer to it. Ask questions, but ask questions to people who you kind of respect, who you know you're going to get a good answer from. I would say once you are in your area that you know you want to be in, obviously then start doing your reading and kind of fill in those knowledge gaps. And a lot of the time it will be experience and getting to see things that kind of gives you that confidence. I would say as well, find someone who will be a good mentor as well. Yes, you will get that as part of your preceptorship, hopefully. But have a look at the people who have really good practice, who work well with patients, who just have that something special about them. and try glean that from them. So again, it's very much like being a student, except rather than following someone around, you get to kind of practice making it your own. I think don't be afraid of making mistakes. You are human, you are learning. Your knowledge is still being built on. And if you find yourself in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, just say, I'm not comfortable doing this and I want help or supervision, or kind of get someone more senior to do it. If that person has a problem with you, then that's their problem. It's not your problem. I've worked in teams where I have been quite adamant that I'm not happy to do something because I haven't had the right training and there's been an issue with it. I've worked with people who I have said the exact same thing to, and their response is that is absolutely fine. Can I show you? Can I teach you? And when you're confident and comfortable, you can be able to do that as well. I would say transition as well. Don't get caught up in the politics. The most important thing is your patient and being an advocate for your patient, rather than whining or moaning about what this person is doing in cubicle or whatever. You kind of see that as a student, but when you're there as a fully qualified and you know you're going to be there for a while, there is a kind of pressure to fit in a little bit more. And it's absolutely fine not to be, because you want to be someone dynamic and different, rather than fitting with the whole school. So I'd say one of the other things as well that I wish I'd known before I had started was having a better understanding of sometimes the emotional drain of your work environment. When you're a student, you're involved in your learning and you're participating, but there's also an element that you have where you're a bit of a fly on the wall, particularly when things go wrong. And not all of you will have experienced death or anything like that within your student days. And again, depending on where you work after you qualify, you may never see that. But keep in mind, when you are working in places like A&E or a neonatal intensive care unit, things are going to go wrong. People aren't going to come through a road collision in one piece. Or yes, they may survive, but there'll be life-changing elements to what happened that's going to affect their life forever. And I think I found when I was a student, yes, you were there, but it was a little bit more observational, because your mentor or someone more senior was kind of taking the lead on all that and having to work through it with that person. But when you're there as registered, suddenly you're that person kind of doing that. And that can take its toll. Like I say, I'm a pediatric nurse, but I also have a young family. So I can work in an area where there's been a car crash or a child has fallen 8 foot from a tree and snapped their neck. And yes, they've survived, but they are going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of their life. And you go home and then you watch your child climbing up a tree. So it's about kind of realizing that, you're seeing the bad stuff, but not to let that affect your personal life and stop you kind of enjoying life outside of work. I think one of the important things to remember, though, because I feel as though I'm talking a little bit doom and gloom all the time, is that when you're first starting out in your new job and you're seeing all these things for the first time, there is a part of you that thinks, this is an awful job, and why am I working here? I'm just being bombarded with information all the time. I'm not sinking, but I'm kind of just treading water. That feeling will go and you will get more confident. And the thing is, you will start seeing the benefits and the good side of all the work and the input that you've put in. There's no better feeling than having a child that comes in who's incredibly unwell and sick, and you put in all this work and all this effort with both the child and the family, and 2 days later they're running around, they're really excited because they're going home, and then a week or two or a month later you kind of see them in the street, kind of on the high street, and they'll come running up to you because they remember you. You had an impact on their life, and that's one of the things to hold on to. It's not all doom and gloom. It will get better. You have the opportunity to make a real impact in someone's life. One of the reasons that I became a nurse was because when my oldest son was ill, we went through this horrible time and things were absolutely terrible, but it was the people involved in our life, the consultants, the nurses, that had the biggest impact, and they took that situation that was awful and they made it okay. And I think if you can accomplish that, that's one of the greatest things that you can do as a nurse. So what top tips would you give those heading towards qualification to help them manage their own transition? I think one of the most important things, and I say this to students now that I'm at a point where I'm getting students to look after and buddy up with, is even when you are qualified, there is no such thing as a stupid question if you don't know the answer to it. You are learning, you're transitioning from that stage of knowing nothing to becoming competent and experienced. And unless you ask the question, unless you see that particular thing over and over, or you get to practice it, you're not going to become confident. So don't feel as though just because you didn't grasp something the very first time around, that there's a pressure for you to kind of just get on with it. Don't ever be afraid to say that I'm not comfortable doing something. If you do not feel comfortable or confident and someone else within your team takes offense to that, it's their problem, it's not yours. I've worked in teams where actually the workload is quite light and people take offense when you say I'm not comfortable doing that because I need further training on it. But I've also worked in areas where there are huge time sensitivities and pressures, and I've said I'm not confident doing that because I don't have the experience, and the reaction has been that's absolutely fine, I can find someone else who can do it, or can I teach you to do it, and then sign you off when you feel that you're confident and comfortable doing it. The important thing is to look after your patient and not put them at risk, but it's also making sure that you don't put yourself at risk. So don't feel that pressure. I'd say the other important thing is making sure that you learn from a very early point to have a good work-life balance. What you probably will have noticed when you're a student is that everyone's short-staffed, and as soon as you have that registration, people are pouncing on you to try and fill in the gaps. And that's great if you want to do it, but also remember that the first 6 months, the first year of being qualified, you are taking on so much information, you are working full time, that your brain and your body just becomes incredibly tired. And it's having that confidence to look after yourself as well. And the thing is, for the very first time, you'll suddenly discover that you're not a poor student anymore, and you can actually go out and enjoy life. So it's finding that balance. I would also say part of transitioning as well is you will get to know what area you want to work in. And yes, you'll go into it thinking, I don't know anything. Actually, you do know a lot more than you think you do. But it's about taking those opportunities to follow your interests and then read around that. I would also say push yourself. If you can do something scary at least once a week that you're not comfortable with, what you'll find is that you're not going to work worrying about seeing something that you've never seen before, because you're used to pushing the boat out a little bit more, if that makes sense. So in summary, what would I say are the most important things that I've learned as being a newly qualified and transitioning into a more competent, confident practitioner? The thing that I always remember and I hold most important to me is my greatest honor as a nurse is being someone's advocate, to be their voice when they have none. And when you work in pediatrics as well, you're not just being the advocate of their child, but that family, and sometimes the other siblings, and trying to explain and express their wishes. And I think if you can remember the advocacy side, everything else will fall around that. Don't be afraid to say no. You don't want to put your patient at risk, and also, mostly importantly, you don't want to put yourself at risk just because someone else is piling pressure on you. It's their problem, it's not yours. You will become more confident, you will become more competent, but you need to do that with the right training. I would say part of that transition as well is also with experience, letting your intuition, your gut feeling grow. A lot of the times I find now, after doing this for a couple of years, if I'm working in A&E, you look at a child and you get a sixth sense that something's not quite right. Physiologically, from an observational perspective, they're absolutely fine, but there's just something in you that says, I need to keep an eye on this because it doesn't feel right. Or in neonates, it's exactly the same thing. You just have a gut feel about a baby on a particular day. And it's about kind of honing in that skill. And if you have a good team, if you have a good set of doctors, it's about developing your relationship with them, that they will listen to kind of those feelings. You may be completely wrong, but at the end of the day, it's better to make a fool of yourself and have a patient that's absolutely fine than have a gut feel about something, not say anything, and that patient crashes or kind of worse dies. Don't be afraid. You're always learning, you're always growing. It doesn't matter if you are on day one of being a newly qualified or if you've done it for 10, 20, 30 years, because everyone says the exact same thing. Just as I feel as though I'm figuring this job out, it changes and I'm learning something new.